see, I need to see a flipper, so I'll just do this. Today is Memorial Day, also the 200th anniversary of the Second War of Independence, the War of 1812. I'd like to pause in memory of that. Buzz can stand if he'd like, or any other veterans in the room. Also, I'd like to point out that Georgia Tech and the Space Solar Power Institute have held the first microwave power transfer symposium at Georgia Tech on December 15th of this recent year. You can get detailed project proposals and descriptions at the Georgia Tech website listed, or at the Space Solar Power Institute or workshop. By the way, the Institute is an off-campus. The Space Solar Power Workshop is on-campus Georgia Tech. These are some of the teams that participated, as well as other off-site teams for a space solar power project. This is a description of what the bottom line they're required to do. The RFP itself was considerably longer. One day I hope we'll have an RFP from Congress to do something similar. Energy is a difficult problem which this country is trying to grapple with. The states in this way, the federal government perhaps in other ways. California perhaps is the leading proponent, arguably, of most of the states have these types of renewable portfolio standards. They're not doing a very good job of implementing them, I would say. This is California's efforts. As Dave Rutledge points out, it's all hat and no cattle. The larger issue, which I think is facing us, is probably oil production. You can hear and read a lot of arguments about whether or not we are maybe at peak oil or will be at peak oil or so forth. But the facts speak more loudly. We have basically been at level, flat global oil production for the last 7 years. That has precipitated, obviously, oil price spikes, which have engendered no response from the oil industries globally. The graph you're looking at, I'll just pause to say, is a chart of the red line is oil production in millions of barrels per day globally. The oil price in light blue is barrels of oil priced in those, that's Brent, since that's what OPEC uses to compare to. We are looking at significant disruptions in the energy industry as a result of oil, which is 90% of our transportation, of course, is coming from oil, as well as, I can quote, 52% of a McDonald's hamburger by weight is oil. Indirectly, of course. Indirectly, of course. They're not that bad. I assumed my audience was well aware of that, but I thank you for pointing it out. There are many other commodities which have been shocked as a result of the energy impacts on the economy. What is of a concern to many of us, I was speaking a week ago at the electric power symposium in Baltimore. I don't know when this next event is going to occur, but I'd point out, let's see. That is anyway, there's going to be a decline in oil production, probably later this decade, which will precipitate significant more difficulty economically than we have seen in the recent past. If we wanted to design a electric or a power generation facility, I was asking them last week, what would it look like? What would we like to have in order to do the best we can to solve our significant energy problems? Basically, it would look like this or something similar. This is an integrated symmetric concentrator. No power company at this point, oh, no aerospace company at this point can afford to build this. It's financially, technically, managerially, politically intractable for Boeing or Raytheon, whoever to do. So, we would like our power generation to be dispatchable or baseload, which means that it's available, unlike wind power, unlike ground solar, unlike biofuels, which are going to be limited severely. Space power would be in full sun about 99.3% of the time. We'd like to have zero fuel cost. Hydro, for example, has zero fuel cost. Hydro has a lot of other constraints, whether you get enough rain, of course, which has been good in some years and bad in others. You've also got issues with drought, flood, and so forth, which take precedent over when you can turn the hydro turbines. You like low emission intensity from CO2. The Japanese, who have the largest project in space power currently, by far, assuming the Chinese haven't surpassed them, which we don't really know, can see that the space power facilities would have far lower CO2 generation than the existing fossil fuel that we use. CO2 is not well known its nutritional impacts. By the year 2050, when CO2 will be is expected to double, then plant available nitrogen will be declining by 40 to 50% under doubled carbon dioxide. Now, while this country is,
Can you expound on that a little?
pardon me?
Can you expound on that a little? I've never heard that. That sounds very important.
Pardon me?
Can you expound on that a little? It sounds very important.
I have a chapter on the website which will give you references about this. It is pretty important, I think. The lower chart of this is the result of ruminants eating the fodder which has been grown at double CO2. They gain weight more slowly. The various impacts of double CO2 on various plants differs. Notably, nutrition from wheat and rice, the top two cereal grains in the world, decline. Wheat grown at double CO2 will decline in protein content by 9 to 13%. It produces poor dough of lower extensibility and decreased loaf volume. I like to give a kind of a shorthand that many of the food products grown at double CO2, it's like feeding a child lots and lots of sugar. They get fat, but it's not the kind of weight gain you really want. Protein content of rice declines. Iron and zinc concentrations in rice are lower. That's just some of the nutritional aspects of why we need lower CO2 to address this. Next item, lower water usage. Every year, Black & Veatch, a large construction industrial builder for the electric power industry, surveys the utilities. And for the first time in 50 years, which is how long they've been doing their survey, the utility industry identified water access as their #1 concern. Water effluent is also in the top 5 of their environmental concerns in their survey. Competition for water in the decade in front of us is expected to increase significantly, especially in South Asia and the Middle East, where adoption of water is already being used as a weapon, perhaps by terrorists, will become more likely. SSP notably uses no water in operation. We'd like to reduce competition for other scarce resources besides water, such as steel, copper, rare earth, etc. SSP's thin film, projected to be used, uses much less high-purity silicon, which means much less energy is required to manufacture the PV. Since that thin film is about 1% as thick compared to, I don't really need these anyway, right now, compared to a typical crystalline ground PV. A PV panel at GEO is estimated to yield 9.6 times as much energy, depending on your precise assumptions. That means that if you take a PV panel on the ground and compare its total energy output for a day, move it to high orbit, I'm going from typical PV installations on the Earth to a typical PV installation in space, you get 9.6 times more energy out of that. Now, in that vein, most recently, a new company called Planetary Resources has been founded, whose stated claim is to go mine the asteroids or near-Earth objects or the moon or whatever to obtain more cheaply off-Earth resources. In fact, they had 2,000 people apply for jobs building and operating asteroid mining robots. I don't think they're quite ready to hire those, they said, but they were happy, I'm sure, to know that there's enthusiasm for this. You'd like to reduce land use. Land is valuable. It, especially for crops, is in increased competition. We would like to be able to support many things on the small amount of arable land in the world, which is also determined partly by water. You'd like it to be environmentally safe. The first complaint, I suppose, that has been lodged, I suppose, most commonly about space solar power is its microwave beams. You could also talk about laser, but I'm not going to go into the laser issues here. I think that's been mentioned elsewhere. This is a typical power density graph, depending on the radius from the bore site. On the left, this is, of course, a logarithmic graph, right? So on the far left, at 3 or 4 kilometers in width, you've got the main lobe where basically all of your power is. Out there, 440 kilometers away, you have a small grading lobe, which notably is below the highly regulated microwave environmental power densities required, which is the key. So you're obeying all the complicated microwave restrictions which have been created over the years, because microwaves are ubiquitous in our environment, from your cell phones to microwave ovens to many, many, many industrial operations and commercial operations. You would like to reduce hazardous nuclear waste. You'd like to reduce access to terrorists for nuclear weapons and materials proliferation. Space power keeps the nuclear materials at a safer distance. And, in a broader sense, minimizing our environmental impact. Existing energy production methods have wide environmental impacts, too numerous to go into at this point. But space power would eventually provide endless, clean energy. Several calculations have been done, assuming you fully populate the geosynchronous band, you'd have roughly 200 terawatts of power, far more than anyone can imagine using on this planet. You'd like to keep energy costs low. Low-cost energy is probably a key reason, if not the key reason, why our environmental problems have hit us in the face since 2008. Leading energy alternatives, which California and other states, federal government are seeking to impose on utilities, are slowly discovering that the physics trumps policy. Japan's space power electricity, which they're planning, is expected to cost customers 8 yen, or 9 cents per kilowatt hour, which is 6 times cheaper than the current cost for that power in Japan. Recently, a Japanese government panel has adopted a feed-in tariff, I'll explain that, of 52 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, what do you pay for a kilowatt hour? Maybe 10 cents, maybe a little higher if you're in California or Long Island. But in Japan, for 20 years, Japan will pay solar providers 52 cents per kilowatt hour for everyone they bring in. Now, if I were in the business of providing space power next week, Japan would be tops on the list for that reason. Not only lower cost generation, but also lower cost access. The transmission grid that California is attempting to build and I would say impose on the western United States is looking at significant increases in cost for access to those transmission grids to provide California or attempt to provide California's or meet California's 33% RPS goal. Ratepayer bills will rise drastically to meet that. And I think you could argue successfully that reliability will decline. These are required transmission upgrades. You'd like it to be simple to export, simple to implement. Space power could be easily exported, and it could be easily moved from one location to another. If some utility, I should talk about the business model a moment. You guys are not utilities, I'm sure. But space power is a very natural fit for our existing utility infrastructure and regulatory and physical grid layout. There has been a significant, very litigious attempt to make our grids distributed. They are currently, or have been currently in virtually every state, based on a central operating plant model, which means you have a very large power plant, a nuclear power plant, or coal or natural gas, for example, and then you branch out from there. Thermodynamic arguments will quickly convince you that larger power generation facilities provide greater efficiency, which translates to lower cost. which is a very desirable thing in most people's opinion. Space power fits very naturally into that arrangement of central power generation, which means you don't have to redesign the U.S. power grid, which is a desirable thing to do, in my opinion. You don't have to go to a distributed model. You don't have to incur the costs. People have been attempting to impose the idea of competitive power generation. They're not happy, understandably, with the power grids and power companies in many of the states, especially on our east and west coasts. But existing utilities provide the massive customer loads and natural access to distribute the large quantities of electric power which naturally result from obeying the laws of physics and making a logical design of a space-powered delivery system, as the original reference study in 1980 pointed out, which would deliver 5 gigawatt hunks, which would be broken up into 1 gigawatt pieces, very much as existing plant models and utilities base their block size are topping out at about 1 gigawatt. The largest power plants are approximately 1 gigawatt in size. They're smaller ones, but you don't want 30% of your grid falling offline at one time because a squirrel chewed through a line or an icy tree fell on it. Typically, electric power companies will have about 10 to 14% of their power generation in what's called spinning reserve. That means if you have a minor accident, wind or ants crawling into the transmission facilities, if you have a facility knocked off, then that 10 to 14% will enable the grid to keep operating without calling up a lot of customers saying you need to get off. Now there are other techniques for managing grids, but this is a typical process having spinning reserve. Texas, for example, which is managed by ERCOT, had a accident, I'll call it, in 2008 when their grid was forced to an emergency down rating because of wind power suddenly or unexpectedly. They're trying to do a better job managing their wind out there. But anyway, so when wind would drop like that, the idea is the spinning reserve would be there to catch it. But the likelihood of various energy generation facilities dropping offline differs, of course, between different generation facilities. Nuclear power plants have traditionally the highest capacity factor, which means they are up about 90% of the time on average. Other plants, say, for example, coal, are usually used in a dispatching or a throttling mode. The reason, you may ask, why are nuclear power plants used in this mode, and it's a good question. The reason is because they have the lowest marginal operational cost. That means it costs a lot to build them, but once you've built them, you can't afford not to run them. Nuclear fuel is actually pretty cheap. Before I go on, this is sort of an important little area. Does anybody any question about general electric power questions in that area?
Just T&D, transmission and distribution?
Yes.
Is that what that is?
T&D is transmission and distribution. That's correct. Did I say that up there? Oh, yes, I did. I'm sorry. That's right. Transmission and distribution.
Question.
Yes.
It's an interesting thing that the losses would occur mostly, I guess, matching the impedances and voltages from the rectennas to the transmission lines. One would think there'd be a lot more ties into the so-called smart grid using, say, superconducting transmission lines to match the rectennas and other elements that, you know, increase the overall efficiency to, say, integrate solar power into this with the least amount of loss, because it's going to be considered base load if they're paying this better price up front for it, and it'll be up, you know, more than the 90% you said nuclear were.
Oh yeah.
So they won't be, they can't afford not to run it, correct?
Correct. It would probably become the default baseload provider. I would expect a wide diversity of other generation options would provide the throttled or peaking components.
And also any
Yes.
excess capability.
I'm sorry, young lady?
I was just going to actually ask about that.
Okay.
It's basically why, because you can steer the beam at the speed instantly, almost faster than the speed of light, the beam itself.
Well, I don't know about that, but go ahead.
But
Yeah, go ahead.
You can steer the beam.
Yeah.
I mean, I'd like the beam, the end of it can move faster.
I understand.
But anyway, you can steer the beam to anywhere, so could you have basically an application to dump in, such as producing hydrogen desalinization, and then use it as dispatchable power?
The difficulty with that is that you're dealing with very large blocks of power, and having done a little strategic planning, to imagine setting up the type of contracts that you're proposing would be extremely problematic. I mean, you'd have somebody, well, can I borrow your power? I mean, suppose you're the power company in Washington, D.C., someone, and it's your power basically it's being delivered. Someone says, well, can we borrow your power today? I don't think your customers are likely to agree to that.
Well, what if it was though something, you know, like in 1 minute chunks? Can I have, you know, 6% of your power this minute and 7% and then 4% and
Well, using phased arrays, you might be able to look at, you know, stuff like that. And in a normal, I think, operation of a space power, indeed, the nominally 1 gigawatt pieces of that would be broken apart to this utility and that utility as they bought shares, if you will, of the rectenna. I'd point out that the rectenna should be the physical, legitimate, legal property of the participating utilities. They would build and own it, not the space power company. So they have I mean, it's part of their grid physically. So, I mean, it's only logical. The space power company, it doesn't want to fiddle with the grid. They don't know about, I don't know, warring tribesmen over here that want to tear it down or whatever issues there are locally. Yes.
The one
Yes.
important beam switching case
Yeah.
is when it's spring and fall when you have an extra satellite, and when one satellite goes into Earth's shadow, the one ahead of it or behind it takes up the load.
It's a difficult contractual arrangement. I don't, it'd be tough.
Wouldn't that be when you would fire up the gas?
Or have a spare satellite.
Yes, sir.
There's obviously a trade-off between the concentration of the beam and the area that you need on the ground.
Certainly.
For the rectennas.
Yes.
And can you comment on the considerations for that? There probably are safety considerations. For example, land use for agriculture.
Yes.
Do you expect it to be safe for humans to be working permanently in that area? Will that be mainly robotically farmed? People going there only for maintenance? What would be the concentration levels that you think would be advisable?
I think legally they will be required by regulation, and I believe it's very doable to have people under the antenna working in there. Yes. You may probably have, you know, farm machinery as well. But,
have you sufficiently spread out that it is?
yes. To the first part of your question, of course, the size of the rectenna is directly dependent on the Fresnel equation, which you look at the frequency, of course, of transmission. 5.8 gigahertz, in my opinion, is what we believe is the one of choice at the moment, because it provides both smaller transmission and rectangle sizes, diameters, and also pretty good window through the atmosphere. So yes, there have been proposals. Originally there was 2.45. There's another legal band in the ISM band at 35 gigahertz or 220, I believe. But and the Russians have even proposed creating another band just for space power. I think it was at 3.7 gigahertz. But yes, it's certainly an important consideration that you have to solve.
Sort of following on that question, is this technology, at least in principle, amenable to needs of small island states, small remote island states? Or is it require such a large area for the receiving area that it only really applies to continental areas?
The economics of the physics for microwave power transfer pretty much dictates that you're going to have large pieces. To do for example, say 100 kilowatt from GEO, the economics just don't work. If you look, for example, at laser, which has a lot of other issues, that's one reason people look at laser, because, well, there's no reason you couldn't deliver a 100 kilowatt laser beam to a small island, for example. But there are other issues, for example, deficiency of lasers and threats of weapons and so forth, clouds notably. But, so that's normally, I think, the most likely power development scenario initially to get this done is microwave power generation, power transfer. So the answer is no. Small islands like, I don't know, the Bahamas or something, if they wanted power, they'd probably run an underground cable from Florida. So that I would guess would be the most economical route. You could do that also. Yeah, once that technology is commercialized and the power, the cost comes down for doing this, it becomes, of course, much more doable. Any other questions on the power generation? Yes, sir.
Just a comment. One of the past sessions, there were some folks from the South Pacific, and they're generating electricity using diesel.
Yeah.
It's costing them about $1.
Yeah.
And they're very interested in having some solar power if it's cheaper than obviously would be.
I'm really interested in it too. A lot of people are, and we need to move forward on it. Yes.
Well, suppose you have one of these archipelago situations. There's a lot of very shallow water. You could build a rectenna above that and take your gigawatt or whatever of power that's practical to deliver there, and use the excess for splitting water, hydrogen.
Yes. Once you have clean, low-cost electric power, there's a myriad of things you can do with this. So, Buzz.
The collectors, solar power collectors.
Rectenna. I haven't specifically talked about rectennas.
No, I don't mean the rectennas.
You're talking about the in high orbit.
Yeah.
The integrated symmetric concentrator, for example.
Yeah. What of that structure? What percentage is just supporting structure of the collectors? Just plain construction elements, I-beams. I understand that obviously mass delivery to GEO of the entire spectrum of collection is a big job.
Yeah, mass delivery is a big problem, and of course we
rocket delivery to low Earth orbit, and maybe able to fly them with
ion beams, plasma drive,
with solar power and some kind of more efficient, higher ISP from low Earth orbit up to geo.
Sure.
Right, but you still have to deliver the structure.
Well, Boeing, for example, has built beam formers. So you just like you make on-site guttering for your house, for example. You feed in feedstock, and out comes preformed beams of what you'd like.
Construction beams.
Construction beams.
Suppose the construction beams were part of the rocket that delivers the payload.
It's certainly worth, I mean, you could look at it, but I would guess, I mean, just from my opinion, that shipping up rolls of guttering material, for example, would be...
I gotta go get the parade.
That's fine. There's certainly alternative suggestions of how you actually would perform this. My contacts? You on a card or something?
Yeah. You can do that or send me what you got at marsguy@buzzaldrin.com.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, and with regard to small islands, or I should say niche markets, we've been looking at the possibility of using either aerostats above the atmosphere to collect the beam energy and drop the cable down to deliver the electric power.
I'm sorry, I didn't catch the question. Was that a comment or a question?
With regard to delivering power from space, small markets, it might be possible to use tether aerostats.
Besides energy chunks.
Well, probably 100 kilowatts or so.
So you must be using much higher frequency.
Yeah.
Yes, much higher.
I think the gentleman speaking, and I made this comment yesterday, if you have an island nation with a lower power requirement, and you wanted to split up the power transmission from a satellite between laser and microwave, you might be able to get smaller chunks with laser and eliminate the cloud loss by putting it on the receptive
Come in.
antenna on a balloon and then delivering it down the land by cable. That's a quite doable option, I think.
But also, if you're 20 or 25 kilometers, you're above the water vapor, so you can even use high frequency microwave.
It's certainly true that there are a wide variety of ways that you can move power around once you have it at low cost and available in large quantities. I agree.
I think we're scheduled to talk about this in a little while.
You'd like to expand the economy. The economy situation is of note today. We'd like more jobs. We have a wide variety of space power technologies available to be implemented to build this. Most of these are in a condition which don't need a lot of work before they could be used to build space power. So we would be able to add a lot more jobs doing something which was a very desirable thing to do. Finally, we'd like to have a substitute to provide high density fuel alternatives for transportation. Since oil supplies over 90% of the energy for world transportation, not to mention plastics and many other things. You could, of course, make anhydrous ammonia, butanol, or other liquid fuels if you have the energy available to do it from water. Ammonia, for example, is 111 octane, same energy as methanol. It was used to fuel the X-15 rocket plane. and we've been making liquid ammonia and pushing around in pipelines. There's issues you can't push ethanol in pipelines. It's too corrosive.
Hydrogen is also very hard.
Yes. So you'd like to minimize the cost of adaptation. So you can make fuels. Biofuels simply can't keep pace, and so far we haven't seen significant biofuel production to replace the massive quantities of gasoline and diesel. Perhaps the happiest small story is down in Brazil, where they are making ethanol, but it doesn't approach the scale that's required. Another thing is electric cars. You could also, as we're doing, Mr. Tesla, car there, company. Two types of automakers, those developing electric cars and those who will be extinct. I imagine a lot of people will be buying electric cars in 10 years or so. They're trying to develop the market now. And eventually, a Sunset Corporation could provide much of its own rocket fuel. A lot of people are not aware of the electromagnetic aircraft launch system now being demonstrated and built to be used on the new Eisenhower class of aircraft carriers. It solves the Navy's difficult problem, which their steam launch systems were not strong enough to launch the next generation of jet fighters, and they were too strong and uncontrollable to launch the very light drones, which they would like to launch off carriers. EMALS will be able to do both. It can be gentler, it can be much tougher, it's much more controllable. So this is an important advance in electromagnetic launch capabilities. So how to proceed? How do you go about building one of these? Historically, the way these have been built in this country has been very painful, because when Abraham Lincoln, our first internet president, because he spent so much time at the telegraph office down in Washington, D.C., when he signed the Transcontinental Railroad and Telegraph Act, it was in the middle of the Civil War. Why did he sign it? It had been talked about for years. Since Megan hasn't appeared yet, I'm going to keep going. And these Confederates had sent a battalion of troops to Albuquerque, where the major gold mines were at that time, hoping to cut off the Union's supply of gold, which was paying the troops, which would be a coup d'etat if they could have done that. But the miners apparently learned of this in their territory and ambushed the Confederates and prevented the claim jumping which the Confederates intended on their gold mines. When word of this got back to D.C., always slow to get the word, they decided, we need faster troop movements, we need better communications out west, and they signed, Lincoln signed the Transcontinental Railroad and Telegraph. The point I'm getting at is, unfortunately, these types of corporations are only formed in great pain and anguish in bloody times. Comstock Corporation was signed in 1962, about the same time I was called out of school to go to a fallout shelter because there were nuclear rockets expected from Cuba any minute. But